The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the black iron railings. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a 34-year-old construction worker from Manchester who had driven down to London for his first visit to the capital. His wife Sarah had suggested the trip to celebrate their 10th wedding anniversary, though Marcus had initially resisted the idea. "I don't see what's so special about watching some guards stand around," he had grumbled while packing their small overnight bag. But Sarah had insisted, reminding him that their daughter Emma would love to hear stories about the palace when they returned home. Now, standing among the crowd of international visitors, Marcus felt his irritation growing. The summer heat was intense and sweat beaded on his forehead as he checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. They had been waiting for over an hour, and the promised changing of the guard ceremony seemed nowhere in sight. "This is ridiculous," Marcus muttered to Sarah, who was trying to take photos through the railings with her phone. "We could have spent this time doing something actually interesting." Sarah shot him a warning look. "Keep your voice down, Marcus. We're here now, so let's make the best of it." The crowd around them was a mix of families with young children, elderly couples with guidebooks, and groups of young backpackers speaking various languages. Everyone seemed patient and excited, which only made Marcus more frustrated. He couldn't understand why people traveled thousands of miles just to look at a building and watch guards who weren't even supposed to move or talk. In front of them, a family from Japan was taking turns posing for photos, their children giggling as they tried to mimic the serious expressions of the guards. An elderly American couple discussed the history of the palace in loud voices, reading facts from their tourist guide to anyone within earshot. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through work messages, trying to distract himself from the wait. His construction crew was working on a new housing development back in Manchester, and he felt guilty about taking time off during such a busy period. The overtime pay would have been useful, especially with Emma starting secondary school in the fall and needing new uniforms and supplies. "Look, there's one of the guards," Sarah whispered excitedly, pointing toward the palace entrance. Marcus looked up to see a figure in the iconic red tunic and tall black bearskin hat walking slowly across the courtyard. The guard moved with precise, mechanical steps, his rifle held at a perfect angle. The crowd pressed closer to the railings, phones and cameras appearing everywhere as people jostled for the best view. "Finally," Marcus said, though he had to admit there was something impressive about the guard's bearing and uniform. The red fabric was immaculate, and the brass buttons gleamed in the sunlight. As more guards appeared, the excitement in the crowd grew. Children were lifted onto parents' shoulders, and tour guides began explaining the ceremony in multiple languages. Marcus found himself getting caught up in the atmosphere despite his earlier complaints. "The uniforms must be incredibly hot in this weather," Sarah observed, watching as the guards maintained their rigid posture despite the sweltering temperature. Marcus nodded, feeling a bit of sympathy for the men. He knew what it was like to work in uncomfortable conditions, though his hard hat and safety vest were nothing compared to the elaborate military dress the guards wore. A young boy near them started crying, overwhelmed by the crowd and heat. His mother tried to comfort him, but the child's wails cut through the excited chatter of the tourists. Marcus noticed how the guard closest to them didn't react at all to the noise, maintaining his stoic expression and perfect posture. "How do they do it?" Sarah wondered aloud. "Standing there like statues while all this chaos happens around them." "Training, I suppose," Marcus replied, though he was beginning to admire the discipline it must take. His own job required focus and precision, but nothing like this level of self-control. The ceremony began with the arrival of more guards, their movements synchronized as they performed the traditional routine. The crowd fell into a respectful silence, broken only by the clicking of cameras and the occasional whispered explanation from parents to their children. Marcus watched as the guards went through their paces, their every movement precise and deliberate. Despite his initial skepticism, he found himself drawn into the spectacle. There was something almost hypnotic about the repetitive nature of their actions, the way they seemed completely isolated from the world around them. "This is actually quite impressive," he admitted to Sarah, who smiled and squeezed his arm. "I told you it would be worth it," she replied, taking another photo. As the ceremony continued, Marcus noticed how the guards seemed completely oblivious to the crowd watching them. They didn't acknowledge the tourists, didn't react to the noise or movement, and certainly didn't respond to the occasional call or wave from an excited visitor. A group of teenagers nearby started making silly faces at one of the guards, trying to get him to break character. The guard remained perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead as if the teenagers didn't exist at all. "They're like robots," Marcus muttered, though there was respect in his voice now rather than irritation. The heat continued to build, and Marcus could see that some of the other tourists were beginning to wilt. An elderly man was fanning himself with his guidebook, and a woman in the crowd was drinking water from a bottle while dabbing at her forehead with a tissue. Yet the guards showed no sign of discomfort. Their faces remained impassive, their posture perfect, their movements as sharp and precise as when the ceremony had begun. Marcus couldn't help but wonder what kind of training produced such discipline. "How much longer do you think this goes on?" he asked Sarah, though he was no longer eager to leave. "I'm not sure," she replied, consulting the brochure they had picked up at their hotel. "But I'm enjoying it more than I expected." Marcus nodded, surprising himself with his agreement. The initial frustration had given way to genuine curiosity about the men behind the uniforms and the traditions they represented. As the ceremony progressed, the crowd grew larger and more restless. What had started as an orderly gathering of tourists was becoming increasingly chaotic as latecomers pushed forward, trying to get a better view. Marcus found himself pressed against the iron railings. Sarah squeezed in beside him as more people crowded behind them. The temperature continued to climb, and Marcus could feel his shirt sticking to his back with sweat. Several tourists had already given up and moved away, seeking shade under the nearby trees, but new arrivals kept taking their places. The constant movement and chatter was becoming overwhelming. "Excuse me, you're blocking my view," complained a woman behind them in a sharp American accent. She was middle-aged with platinum blonde hair and wore expensive-looking designer clothes that seemed completely inappropriate for standing in a crowd in the London heat. Marcus turned to see her, pushing past an elderly couple, her large handbag knocking into people as she forced her way forward. She had the entitled attitude of someone accustomed to getting her way, and her voice carried over the general noise of the crowd. "I paid good money for this tour," she continued loudly, addressing no one in particular. "I expect to get proper photos for my social media." Sarah rolled her eyes at Marcus, who was trying to ignore the woman's complaints. He had met plenty of demanding people in his work as a construction foreman, and he recognized the type immediately. The woman reminded him of some of the wealthy homeowners who hired his crew, people who expected perfection but had no understanding of the actual work involved. The American woman, who had introduced herself loudly to several people as Brenda Patterson from Texas, continued to push forward until she was right at the front of the crowd. She immediately began taking photos with an expensive camera, positioning herself to get the best angles of the guards. "These guards are so serious," she announced to anyone listening. "Don't they ever smile? In Texas, our soldiers are much more friendly." Marcus noticed that one of the guards was positioned very close to where they were standing. He was a young man, probably in his early 20s, with a serious expression beneath his tall black hat. Despite the heat, there wasn't a single bead of sweat visible on his face, and his red uniform looked as crisp as if he had just put it on. "I wonder what they're thinking about while they stand there," Sarah mused quietly. "Probably counting down the minutes until their shift ends," Marcus replied, though he was genuinely curious about the same thing. Brenda had moved closer to the railings and was now taking photos from multiple angles, her camera clicking constantly. She seemed completely focused on getting the perfect shot, paying no attention to the other tourists she was elbowing out of the way. "Stand still," she called out to the guard nearest to them, as if he were a model posing for her personal photo. "Shoot, I need better lighting for this shot." Several people in the crowd looked uncomfortable with her behavior, but no one said anything. The guard, of course, gave no indication that he had heard her at all. Marcus was starting to feel claustrophobic in the pressed crowd. The combination of heat, noise, and too many people in a small space was making him irritable again. He could see that Sarah was also beginning to look uncomfortable. Her face flushed from the temperature. "Maybe we should move back a bit," he suggested, but there was nowhere to go. More tourists had packed in behind them, and they were effectively trapped at the front of the crowd. A group of school children on a field trip had arrived, their teacher struggling to keep them together as they pushed through the crowd. The children were excited and loud, pointing and calling out to the guards who continued to ignore them completely. "Look at his funny hat," one of the children shouted, causing several adults to shush him. Brenda was becoming increasingly frustrated with her photography. The angle wasn't right. The lighting kept changing as clouds passed over the sun, and other tourists kept walking into her shots. "This is ridiculous," she announced loudly. "How am I supposed to get good photos with all these people moving around?" She began waving her arms to get people to move out of her way, treating the public space as if it were her private studio. Marcus watched her behavior with growing annoyance, recognizing the selfishness that seemed to drive some tourists to behave badly when traveling. The guard closest to them remained perfectly motionless, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the crowd's heads. Marcus found himself studying the young man's face, trying to imagine what it must be like to maintain such discipline while surrounded by chaos. "Excuse me, guard," Brenda called out, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd noise. "Could you turn slightly to your left? The light would be better for my photo." A murmur of disapproval went through the crowd. Even the tourists who didn't speak English seemed to understand that she was behaving inappropriately. Several people looked embarrassed to be associated with her by proximity. The guard didn't react at all to her request, maintaining his rigid posture and neutral expression. His training had clearly prepared him for exactly this kind of situation, and he handled it with the same professional detachment he showed to everything else. "I don't think they're allowed to respond to requests like that," Sarah said quietly to Marcus, though she spoke loudly enough that Brenda could hear. "Well, that's just poor customer service," Brenda replied dismissively. "In Texas, our public servants are much more helpful." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. The woman's attitude was grating on him more with each passing minute. Her entitlement and lack of respect for the traditions she was supposed to be observing struck him as exactly the kind of ugly tourist behavior that gave visitors a bad reputation. The ceremony was reaching its climax, with guards moving in formation and performing the traditional exchange of duties. The crowd had grown even larger, and the pressure against the railings was becoming intense. Marcus could feel the metal bars digging into his ribs as more people pushed from behind. Brenda had climbed onto something behind them to get a better angle for her photos, but she was still not satisfied with the results. Her frustration was becoming more obvious, and her complaints were growing louder and more frequent. "This whole thing is so poorly organized," she declared. "They should have better viewing areas for tourists who are serious about photography." The irony of her criticism wasn't lost on Marcus. She was complaining about organization while being the most disorganized and disruptive person in the entire crowd. Her selfish behavior was making the experience less enjoyable for everyone around her, but she seemed completely oblivious to this fact. The situation was rapidly deteriorating as Brenda's behavior became increasingly erratic. The heat, combined with her growing frustration at not getting the perfect photograph, was making her more aggressive and demanding. She had now positioned herself directly at the front of the crowd, pushing aside a family with young children who had been waiting patiently for over an hour. "Move back, please," she commanded the family in an imperious tone. "I need this space for my professional photography." The father of the family, a quiet man who appeared to be from somewhere in Eastern Europe, tried to explain in broken English that his children couldn't see if they moved back. Brenda dismissed him with a wave of her hand, acting as if his concerns were completely irrelevant. Marcus watched this exchange with growing anger. He had always believed in treating people with basic respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. His own upbringing in Manchester had taught him the value of fairness and consideration for others, values that seemed completely foreign to the woman monopolizing the front of the crowd. "She's out of line," he muttered to Sarah, who nodded in agreement. "Someone should say something to her," Sarah replied, though neither of them wanted to cause a scene themselves. The guard who had been the focus of much of Brenda's attention was a young man named James Morrison, though of course none of the tourists knew his name. He was 23 years old and had been serving in the Queen's Guard for just over a year. This was his third time on duty at Buckingham Palace, and he had been looking forward to the assignment despite the challenging conditions. James had grown up in a small town in Wales, where his grandfather had told him stories about his own military service. The tradition and honor of the Queen's Guard had appealed to James from a young age, and he had worked hard to earn his position. The training had been rigorous, focusing not just on military skills, but on the mental discipline required to maintain composure under any circumstances. Standing motionless for extended periods while crowds of tourists watched and photographed him was one of the more challenging aspects of the job. James had learned to focus his mind on specific techniques to maintain his concentration, but the growing chaos around him was testing his limits. He could hear Brenda's increasingly demanding comments, though his training required him to show no reaction whatsoever. The woman had been calling out to him for several minutes now, treating him like a prop in her personal photo shoot rather than a serving soldier performing his duties. Through his peripheral vision, James could see that the crowd was becoming more agitated. The heat and overcrowding were making people uncomfortable, and the American woman's behavior was clearly annoying many of the other tourists. He had been in similar situations before, but never with someone quite so persistent and inappropriate. Brenda had now pulled out her phone in addition to her camera and was taking both photos and videos simultaneously. She was narrating for her social media followers, describing the quaint British ceremony in terms that many of the British tourists around her found condescending and offensive. "These guards are like little toy soldiers," she announced loudly while filming. "They can't move or speak, just like dolls. It's so primitive compared to modern military presentations." Her commentary was attracting negative attention from the crowd. Several people were looking at her with obvious disapproval, and a few were making quiet comments about her behavior. The family she had displaced was particularly upset, with the children unable to see the ceremony they had been waiting so long to witness. Marcus found himself looking around for some kind of official who might intervene, but the police officers present were focused on managing traffic and crowd control at a distance. There didn't seem to be anyone specifically responsible for managing tourist behavior at the immediate site of the ceremony. The heat was becoming oppressive, and James could feel sweat beginning to form under his heavy uniform. The bearskin hat was particularly uncomfortable in the high temperature, but his training had prepared him for physical discomfort. What was more challenging was maintaining his mental focus while the woman continued her inappropriate commentary and demands. "Guard, guard," Brenda called out again, her voice becoming shrill. "I need you to turn just a little bit to your right. The shadow from your hat is wrong in my photos." This time, her demand was met with audible protests from the crowd. Several people told her to be quiet and show respect, but she seemed oblivious to their criticism. "I'm a paying tourist," she replied defensively. "I have every right to get good photos." An elderly British gentleman near the back of the crowd spoke up with the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Young lady, this is not a theme park. These are working soldiers performing their duties. Your behavior is quite inappropriate." Brenda turned to face him, her expression defiant. "I don't need lectures from locals about how to be a tourist. I've traveled all over the world and I know my rights." The confrontation was drawing even more attention, and Marcus could see that the situation was escalating beyond mere rudeness into something potentially more serious. The woman's sense of entitlement seemed to have no limits, and she appeared completely unable to recognize how offensive her behavior was to everyone around her. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, sensing his growing anger. "Let's just move away from here," she suggested quietly. "We don't need to get involved in this." But Marcus was finding it increasingly difficult to ignore the woman's behavior. Her treatment of the family with children and her complete disrespect for the guard and the ceremony were triggering his sense of justice. He had always stood up for people who couldn't defend themselves, and the guard's requirement to remain silent and motionless made him particularly vulnerable to this kind of harassment. James, meanwhile, was drawing on every technique he had learned to maintain his composure. He focused on his breathing, keeping it slow and steady despite the stress of the situation. He reminded himself of the honor and tradition he was representing, and the importance of maintaining the dignity of his position regardless of the circumstances. But Brenda was far from finished with her inappropriate behavior, and the worst was yet to come. The tension in the crowd had reached a breaking point. Brenda's behavior was no longer just annoying, it was becoming genuinely disturbing to witness. She seemed completely disconnected from the reality of the situation, treating the ceremony and the people involved as if they existed solely for her entertainment and convenience. "This is taking forever," she announced loudly, checking her expensive watch with an exaggerated sigh. "Don't these people have anything better to do than play dress-up?" Her comment was met with a chorus of disapproving murmurs from the crowd. A middle-aged British woman nearby spoke up firmly. "These are not actors, madam. They are serving members of Her Majesty's Armed Forces." Brenda waved dismissively. "Whatever they are, they're not very good at customer service. I've been trying to get a decent photo for 20 minutes, and this one won't even acknowledge me." She gestured toward James, as if he were an inanimate object rather than a human being. The dehumanizing nature of her comments was striking, and Marcus felt his anger building to dangerous levels. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Sarah noticed his physical reaction with concern. "Marcus, let's go," she whispered urgently. This isn't worth getting upset about. But Marcus was having trouble controlling his emotions. The woman's behavior reminded him of every entitled customer who had ever treated him and his workers like servants. Every wealthy homeowner who had looked down on them despite depending on their skills and hard work. The parallel to his own experiences made her treatment of the guard feel personal. James was struggling more than he had ever struggled before to maintain his composure. The woman's constant demands and commentary were like a steady assault on his concentration. He had been trained to ignore distractions, but nothing in his preparation had quite prepared him for someone this persistently inappropriate. His training instructor had told him that there would be difficult moments, situations where tourists would test his discipline. But the scenarios they had practiced involved brief incidents, not this sustained campaign of harassment. James found himself fighting not just to remain still, but to control his growing frustration with the woman's behavior. Brenda had now begun circling around the guard looking for better angles for her photographs. She was completely ignoring the barriers and guidelines that were meant to keep tourists at a respectful distance. Her movements were drawing the attention of the police officers in the distance, but they were still dealing with traffic issues and hadn't yet focused on the developing situation. "Perfect lighting from this angle," she announced, positioning herself uncomfortably close to James. She was now only about 3 feet away from him, well within what most people would consider personal space, though of course the guard was not in a position to step back or ask her to move. The crowd was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Parents were covering their children's eyes, not wanting them to witness such disrespectful behavior. The elderly gentleman who had spoken up earlier was looking around for an official to intervene, but none was immediately available. Marcus could see that the woman was working herself up to something even more inappropriate. Her behavior had been escalating steadily, and there was a manic quality to her movements and speech that suggested she was losing all sense of boundaries. "You know what?" Brenda said suddenly, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd noise. "I bet I can make him react. These British soldiers can't be that well trained." A hush fell over the immediate area as people realized what she was suggesting. Several tourists began pulling out their phones, some to document what they sensed was about to happen, others preparing to call for help. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm more tightly. "We need to leave right now," she said firmly. But the crowd was too dense for them to move quickly, and Marcus was too focused on what was unfolding in front of him to seriously consider leaving. James could sense that something was about to happen. The woman's energy had shifted, becoming more aggressive and unpredictable. He drew on every ounce of his training, focusing his mind and preparing himself for whatever was coming. He reminded himself that his duty was to maintain the dignity and tradition of his position, regardless of provocation. "I'm going to test his discipline," Brenda announced to her phone camera, apparently live-streaming the entire incident. "Let's see how professional these British toy soldiers really are." The crowd began to back away slightly, instinctively creating more space around what they sensed was about to become a confrontation. Marcus found himself in the difficult position of being too close to easily escape, but also having a clear view of everything that was about to unfold. Brenda approached the guard even more closely, now standing directly in front of him at a distance that would be considered invasive in any normal social situation. James kept his eyes fixed on the point above the crowd that he had been trained to focus on, but he could see her in his peripheral vision, and her proximity was deeply uncomfortable. "Hello there, soldier boy," she said in a mock flirtatious voice that made several people in the crowd gasp audibly. "Don't you want to say hello to a nice American lady?" When James maintained his professional composure and didn't respond, Brenda's expression darkened. The rejection of her attention seemed to trigger something in her, and her behavior shifted from inappropriate to genuinely threatening. "I'm talking to you," she said more sharply. "It's rude to ignore someone who's trying to be friendly." She reached out her hand as if to touch his uniform, and several people in the crowd shouted warnings. James could see her hand approaching but was bound by his training and duty to remain motionless. The situation had moved beyond anything he had been specifically prepared for, but his instinct was still to maintain his position and trust that help would arrive. Marcus had seen enough. The woman was clearly about to assault the guard, and no one in authority was close enough to intervene. Despite Sarah's attempts to hold him back, he began pushing forward through the crowd, his protective instincts overriding his usual preference for avoiding confrontation. What happened next would be replayed countless times on social media and news broadcasts around the world. In a moment that seemed to unfold in slow motion, Brenda raised her hand and delivered a sharp slap across James's face. The sound of her palm connecting with his cheek echoed across the courtyard, audible even above the gasps and shouts of the horrified crowd. The silence that followed was deafening. For a split second, nobody moved. The tourists stood frozen in shock, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Even the other guards in the distance seemed to pause in their movements, though they maintained their positions as their training demanded. James's face stung from the impact, but more than the physical pain was the shock of the assault. Nothing in his training had prepared him for being physically attacked by a tourist. His instinct was to respond, to defend himself, but years of discipline held him in place. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that he was human and not the statue Brenda had been treating him as. The crowd erupted into chaos. Shouts of outrage filled the air as people expressed their horror at what they had just seen. Several tourists began calling for police while others started recording with their phones, capturing the aftermath of the incident that was already being live-streamed on Brenda's social media. "Oh my God," Sarah gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. She looked around wildly, searching for someone in authority who could handle the situation. Marcus felt a rage unlike anything he had ever experienced. The image of the helpless guard being struck by this entitled tourist triggered something primal in him. Without thinking, he pushed through the remaining people between him and Brenda, his face dark with anger. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted at her, his Manchester accent thick with fury. "He's a serving soldier, not your personal entertainment." Brenda turned to face him, her expression showing no remorse for what she had just done. If anything, she seemed pleased with herself, as if she had accomplished exactly what she had set out to do. "He was ignoring me," she said with a shrug, as if this justified her assault. "I was just trying to get his attention for my photos. These people need to learn some customer service skills." "Customer service?" Marcus was incredulous. "He's not working in a bloody shop. He's on guard duty for the royal family." The crowd around them was growing more agitated by the moment. The family that Brenda had pushed aside earlier was staring in shock, the parents covering their children's eyes and trying to shield them from the ugly scene. The elderly British gentleman was red-faced with indignation, demanding loudly that someone call the authorities. "This is absolutely disgraceful," he declared in his crisp, upper-class accent. "An assault on a member of Her Majesty's Guard is an assault on the crown itself." Other tourists began joining in the condemnation. A group of German visitors who had been quietly observing the ceremony began speaking angrily among themselves. Even tourists who didn't speak English seemed to understand that something terrible had happened, and their body language showed their disapproval. Brenda, however, seemed oblivious to the hostility she had generated. She was still holding her phone, apparently continuing to live stream the incident to her social media followers. "You people need to calm down," she told the crowd dismissively. "It was just a little tap to get his attention. He's fine." A little tap? Marcus stepped closer to her, his hands shaking with anger. "You assaulted a soldier who can't defend himself." James remained at his post, though the effort to maintain his composure was enormous. The slap had been shocking enough, but the argument, now raging around him, was almost as difficult to endure. He wanted desperately to speak up, to defend himself and explain that what had happened was completely inappropriate, but his duty required silence. The sound of whistles could be heard in the distance as police officers began responding to the calls for help. Several tourists were waving frantically, trying to direct the officers toward the scene of the incident. Brenda seemed to realize for the first time that her actions might have consequences. She looked around at the hostile faces surrounding her and began to show signs of uncertainty. "Look, everyone needs to relax," she said, her voice becoming defensive. "I'm an American tourist. I have rights here. I was just trying to get a good photo for my followers." "Your rights don't include assaulting people," Marcus shot back. "I don't care what country you're from." Sarah had managed to push through the yaoi crowd and was now at Marcus's side, trying to calm him down before the situation escalated further. "Marcus, the police are coming," she said urgently. "Let them handle this." But Marcus was beyond reasoning. The injustice of what he had witnessed had triggered every protective instinct he possessed. The sight of someone in uniform being attacked while unable to defend himself had brought back memories of his own father, who had served in the military and had always taught Marcus to respect those who served their country. "She needs to apologize," he demanded, pointing at Brenda. "Right now, in front of everyone." Brenda laughed, a harsh sound that made several people in the crowd recoil. "Apologize? For what? I didn't hurt anybody. He's still standing there, isn't he?" Her complete lack of understanding about what she had done wrong was almost as shocking as the original assault. The crowd's anger was building to a dangerous level, and several people began shouting at her simultaneously. "Disgraceful. Show some respect. You should be arrested." The noise was becoming overwhelming, and James found himself struggling to maintain his focus. The situation had spiraled completely out of control, and he was trapped in the center of it, unable to move or speak while chaos raged around him. Police officers were now running toward the scene, pushing through the crowd of tourists who had gathered to witness the unprecedented incident. The arrival of law enforcement marked a turning point in the confrontation, though the full consequences of Brenda's actions were only just beginning to unfold. The arrival of the Metropolitan Police officers brought a sudden sense of authority to the chaotic scene. Two constables pushed through the crowd, their presence immediately commanding attention and creating space around the central figures of the incident. "Right, what's going on here?" demanded the senior officer, a seasoned constable named P.C. Williams, who had been patrolling the area for over 15 years. He had seen plenty of tourist incidents, but nothing quite like what witnesses were describing to him in rapid overlapping accounts. "She slapped the guard," several people shouted simultaneously, pointing at Brenda, who was now looking considerably less confident than she had moments before. "That woman assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard," the elderly gentleman declared with authority. "I saw it with my own eyes." P.C. Williams looked at James, who remained rigidly at his post despite everything that had happened. The officer could see the slight redness on the guard's cheek where he had been struck, and his expression hardened as he turned back to Brenda. "Madam, I need you to step away from the guard and come with me," he said firmly. "This is ridiculous," Brenda protested, though her voice was less certain than before. "I'm an American citizen. You can't arrest me for taking photos." "Nobody mentioned arrest, madam," P.C. Williams replied calmly. "But I have multiple witnesses saying you assaulted a serving member of the military. That's a serious allegation that needs to be investigated." The crowd began to quiet down as the official response got underway. Marcus felt some of his anger starting to subside, though he was still shaking with adrenaline from the confrontation. Sarah took his arm and guided him back slightly, giving the police room to work. "Are you willing to make a statement about what you witnessed?" P.C. Williams asked Marcus, recognizing him as someone who had been prominently involved in the immediate aftermath. "Absolutely," Marcus replied without hesitation. "I saw the whole thing. She was harassing him for 20 minutes before she hit him." Other witnesses began volunteering their accounts, and P.C. Williams quickly realized that he had an overwhelming amount of evidence about what had occurred. The incident had been witnessed by dozens of people, many of whom had recorded at least part of it on their phones. Brenda was becoming increasingly agitated as she began to understand the seriousness of her situation. "This is insane," she said, her voice rising. "He's just standing there like a robot. I barely touched him." "That robot is a highly trained soldier serving his country," P.C. Williams responded sharply. "And assault is assault, regardless of how lightly you think you struck him." The second officer had been taking statements from witnesses, and the picture that emerged was damning for Brenda. Multiple people described her escalating behavior, her harassment of the guard, and the deliberate nature of her assault. Several tourists had captured the actual slap on video, providing clear evidence of what had occurred. James continued to stand at his post, though he could feel the weight of everyone's attention on him. His training had not prepared him for being the center of such a public incident, but his discipline held firm. He knew that maintaining his composure was more important now than ever, as the dignity of his position was being tested in front of the world. "I want to speak to the American embassy," Brenda demanded, finally seeming to grasp that she was in serious trouble. "This is a violation of my rights as a tourist." "You'll have that opportunity, madam," P.C. Williams assured her. "But first you need to come to the station to give your account of events." As the police prepared to escort Brenda away, the crowd began to disperse slowly. Many tourists remained to give statements, while others simply wanted to distance themselves from the unpleasant scene. The ceremony that had brought everyone together had been completely overshadowed by one person's inappropriate behavior. Marcus watched as Brenda was led away, still protesting her innocence and demanding special treatment because of her nationality. He felt a mixture of satisfaction that justice was being served and sadness that such a beautiful tradition had been marred by someone's selfishness and entitlement. "Thank you for speaking up," Sarah said quietly to her husband. "Someone needed to defend that poor guard." Marcus nodded, though he was still processing everything that had happened. The incident had triggered something deep in him about standing up for people who couldn't defend themselves, values that his father had instilled in him from a young age. As the immediate crisis subsided, other members of the Queen's Guard arrived to relieve James from his post. The young soldier was finally able to step away from his position, though he maintained his military bearing as he was escorted inside the palace grounds. P.C. Williams approached Marcus and Sarah before they could leave. "I'll need formal statements from both of you," he explained. "This will likely go to court, and your testimony will be important." "Of course," Marcus replied. "Whatever it takes to make sure she faces consequences for what she did." The officer handed them cards with contact information and explained the process for giving formal statements. As they prepared to leave, Marcus couldn't help but look back at the spot where the incident had occurred. The ceremony was continuing with new guards, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Word of the incident was already spreading beyond the immediate area. Social media posts were beginning to appear, and news organizations were picking up the story. Brenda's own live stream of the event had been seen by hundreds of her followers before she was taken away by police, ensuring that her assault on the guard would be preserved for posterity. In the days that followed, the incident became international news. Videos of the slap went viral, sparking discussions about tourist behavior, respect for military traditions, and the challenges faced by ceremonial guards who must remain silent and motionless, regardless of provocation. Brenda Patterson found herself facing serious criminal charges in a foreign country, with her own social media posts serving as evidence against her. Her employer back in Texas terminated her position after the videos surfaced, and she became an unwitting symbol of entitled tourist behavior. James Morrison, meanwhile, received support from military leadership and the public alike. His professionalism in the face of assault was praised as an example of the discipline and dedication expected of the Queen's Guard. He returned to duty after a brief period of leave, though the incident had given him a new perspective on the challenges of his role. Marcus and Sarah completed their London visit with a new appreciation for the traditions they had witnessed and the people who upheld them. The incident had turned what was supposed to be a simple tourist experience into something much more meaningful, reinforcing their belief in the importance of treating others with dignity and respect. The story became a cautionary tale about the consequences of treating cultural traditions and the people who maintain them as mere entertainment. It served as a reminder that behind every uniform, every ceremony, and every tradition are real people deserving of basic human respect, regardless of their obligation to remain silent in the face of provocation. Years later, when Marcus told the story to his daughter Emma, he emphasized not just what had happened, but why it mattered. The incident at Buckingham Palace had been about more than one tourist's bad behavior. It had been about the fundamental values of respect, dignity, and standing up for those who cannot defend themselves. These were lessons that transcended cultural boundaries and spoke to the best impulses of human nature when faced with injustice.